This morning, the Supreme Court now announced its decision in McCutcheon v. Federal Election Commission, the latest in a series of rulings that have done away with any meaningful limits on money in politics. Since the Supreme Court issued its ruling in Citizens United in 2010, we've witnessed the systematic unraveling of our nation's campaign finance laws. I'm sure that this is a cause for celebration for some, the super wealthy and well-funded corporate interests, because after all, these rulings give them more influence, more access, and more power as if they need it. Then there's everybody else, everyday folks in Minnesota and around the country who don't have the luxury of pouring millions of dollars into political campaigns. There's a senior on a fixed income who gives $25 to the candidate she likes, maybe someone fighting to contain the cost of prescription drugs. That $25 donation, that's real money for that senior, but it's nothing compared to the $25 million that the pharmaceutical industry can now spend to elect the other candidate. There's a middle-class mom who has just enough money to buy her kids' school clothes, but surely doesn't have enough left over to buy an election, too. And there's a small business owner in the suburbs who's so concerned about making payroll that you can't even begin to think about making a huge campaign contribution. Our democracy can't function the way it's supposed to when these voices are drowned out by a flood of corporate money. So for those who believe that the measure of democracy's strength is in votes cast, not dollars spent, well, for us, there's nothing to celebrate today. Citizens United was, in my view, one of the worst decisions in the history of the Supreme Court. By a 5-4 margin, the court ruled that corporations have a constitutional right to spend as much money as they want to influence elections. Big Oil wants to spend millions of dollars to attack a guy who's advocating for more renewable fuels. The Supreme Court says, sure, go ahead. Huge corporations want to run endless radio ads against a candidate who promises to raise the minimum wage. The Supreme Court says, fine, go ahead. The Wall Street banks want to pour money into a campaign to undo consumer protection laws. The Supreme Court says that that's their constitutional right. So there's not much that you can do about it. That's the way the court sees it. But it's not that way as I see it. It's not that way. It's not the way that most Minnesotans see it either. I think we should be able to say enough is enough, that there's too much corporate money in politics, that some reasonable limits on campaign spending are not just appropriate, they're necessary. And really, that's what Citizens United was all about, the case that got us into this mess. It sort of came down to the question, can we, the people, place any real limit on the amount of money that corporations spend on elections? The answer should have been yes. Of course we can. But 5 Supreme Court justices said, no, we can't. Their logic was unprecedented, literally unprecedented. To reach the result it did, the Supreme Court had to overturn a case, Austin v. Michigan Chamber of Commerce, a law that had been, a decision that had been on the books for 20 years. Overturning Austin wasn't some minor technical change to the law. It was a radical shift, an exercise in pro-corporate judicial activism. Just compare what the court said about corporate campaign expenditures in Austin to what it said 20 years later in Citizens United. In Austin, the court refused to strike down a Michigan law that limited corporate spending on elections. The court explained that the law served a, quote, compelling interest, namely preventing corporations from gaining an unfair advantage in the political system. The Austin court said that, quote, corporate wealth can unfairly influence elections. Those are the Supreme Court's words in 1990, that corporate wealth can unfairly influence elections. The court explained that campaign finance laws prevent, quote, the corrosive and distorting effects of immense aggregations of wealth that are accumulated with the help of the corporate form, end quote. In other words, there's good reason, no, a compelling reason to be worried about unlimited corporate money in politics. Had today's Supreme Court followed precedent, Citizens United would have been an easy case. I mean, I would have written the opinion in a couple of minutes. It would have gone something like this, quote, laws limiting corporate campaign expenditures are constitutional. See Austin v. Michigan Chamber of Commerce. The end. End quote. Of course, that's not the opinion the court wrote in Citizens United. The court's opinion was a lot longer and a lot worse. Here's the one phrase that sums up the Citizens United decision, quote, we now conclude that independent expenditures, including those made by corporations, do not give rise to corruption or the appearance of corruption, end quote. The majority of the court told us that there's no reason at all to be worried about unlimited corporate money in politics anymore, that it does not give rise even to the appearance of corruption. And the logic goes, since there's no reason to be concerned about it, there's no constitutional basis to regulate it, that's what the court tells us. But we know better. The court's analysis not only is disconnected from precedent, it's disconnected from reality. The Minnesota League of Women Voters recently issued a report in which it concluded that, quote, the influence of money in politics represents a dangerous threat to the health of our democracy in Minnesota and nationally, end quote. The Minnesota League of Voters. That sounds right to me. Because here's the thing, in our democracy, everyone is supposed to have an equal say, regardless of his or her wealth. The guy in the assembly line gets as many votes as the CEO, one. You don't get extra votes just because you have extra money. You don't get a greater say just because you have greater wealth. It doesn't work that way, or it shouldn't. Citizens United turned the whole thing on its head. It basically said that those among us with the most money get the most influence. And not only that, there's no limit to the amount of money the wealthy can spend or the amount of influence that they can buy. And I think that's inherently corrupting. Unfortunately, Citizens United was just the beginning of the story. And in the years since, we've seen courts across the country strike down campaign finance laws, ushering in what are known as super PACs, wealthy groups that can raise and spend unlimited money to influence elections. And today in McCutcheon, the court took Citizens United a step further, striking down a law that limited the amount of money that people could give directly to candidates and political parties. In doing so, the court overturned a key holding from Buckley v. Vallejo, a case from 1976. Until today, the law said that direct contributions to candidates, parties, and certain PACs could not exceed above about $125,000 in aggregate per election cycle. The law was intended to stem the tide of money in politics and maintain the integrity of our public institutions. But as of this morning, that law has been taken off the books at the Supreme Court's direction. As Justice Breyer explained in his dissenting opinion in McCutcheon today, quote, taken together with Citizens United, today's decision eviscerates our nation's campaign finance laws, leaving a remnant incapable of dealing with the grave problems of democratic legitimacy that those laws were intended to resolve, end quote. He's right. Changing the law has real consequences. What happens when you get rid of the speed limit? People with fast cars drive faster, as fast as they want to drive. What happens when you get rid of campaign finance limits? Well, special interests with a lot of money spend more of it on politics, as much as they want to spend. That's not a theory, it's an empirical fact. According to data collected by the Center for Responsive Politics, spending by outside groups more than tripled from 2008 to 2012, with overall outside spending topping $1 billion, billion with a B, for the first time in history. Where's the new money coming from? Well, in most cases, we don't know. More on that a little later. But what we do know is pretty much what you'd expect. According to one study, 60% of super PAC's funding in the 2012 election cycle came from just 132 donors, each donating at least $1 million. So we have a relatively small group of super wealthy people accounting for most of the money. Remember when the Citizens United Court assured us that all of this new money in politics was okay, that we shouldn't be worried about it, that it, quote, will not cause the electorate to lose faith in our democracy? Wow, were they wrong. People are losing faith in our democracy, and can you blame them? The system is broken, and we need to fix it. There are a number of good proposals out there. I'd like to use this opportunity to mention 3 of them: disclosure, public financing, and a constitutional amendment. First, we need greater disclosure. The problem in the post-Citizens United world isn't just that there is now unlimited money in politics, it's also that we have no idea where that money is coming from. Billionaires and big corporations want to influence elections by giving unlimited money to super PACs, but they don't want anyone to know that they're the ones pulling the strings, so they do something that looks a lot like money laundering, except that it's perfectly legal. Let's say there's a bunch of corporations and billionaires out there who want to preserve indefensible tax loopholes that really only help their bottom lines. Their allies form a super PAC whose mission is to do just that, preserve their big tax breaks. Now, the super PAC needs a name. Americans for Indefensible Tax Loopholes probably doesn't achieve their end. So the super PAC decides to go with something like Americans for a Better Tax Code. After all, who could be against that? Now, remember, the corporations or the billionaires who are behind this whole thing, they don't want their fingerprints on this. So they pass their money through shell corporations before it ends up in the super PAC. That way, the actual donors don't show up on the federal disclosure forms. Now, the TV is then flooded with attack ads that end something like, paid for by Americans for a Better Tax Code. But nobody has any idea who's actually behind the advertisement. There's just no good way to find out. But hang on, it gets worse. In addition to all the secret money being spent by these super PACs, there's a bunch of nonprofit organizations that are using a glitch in the tax code to keep all of their campaign activities secret. These groups, liberal or conservative, don't have to disclose a single penny. Combine them with the super PACs, and you have a lot of money and very little information. Voters aren't just being flooded, they're being blindfolded too. We have a bill called the Disclose Act that would go a long way toward fixing this problem. It would put in place a clear set of rules requiring disclosure whenever anyone spends more than $10,000 to influence an election, even when that money is being funneled through back channels. The idea is pretty simple. If you're going to spend that kind of money to influence elections, people should know about it so they can make informed decisions and effectively evaluate what you have to say. This is all about transparency and accountability. All of us should be able to get behind that. And indeed, most of us already have. The last version of the Disclose Act had support from a majority of senators, and I'm proud to have been one of the bill's co-sponsors. Several of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have spoken enthusiastically about greater disclosure. They've said things like, sunshine is the greatest disinfectant. Even the Supreme Court has endorsed disclosure laws in both Citizens United and today's decision. And poll after poll shows that the vast majority of Americans support greater transparency in campaign finance. This is a basic step that we should be able to take pretty easily, or you'd think so. Turns out you'd be wrong. In July of 2012, we brought the Disclose Act to the Senate floor, and Republicans blocked it. The bill died before it could get an up or down vote, but we're not going to give up on it. I'll continue to work with my colleagues to make the campaign finance system more transparent. Here's another thing we can do, fundamentally change the way candidates finance their campaigns. Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois recently reintroduced the Fair Elections Now Act, which basically says that candidates who refuse to accept contributions of more than $150 will be eligible for public financing of their campaigns. This would level the playing field. Instead of campaigns that are funded by a handful of wealthy donors, we'll have citizen-funded grassroots campaigns where candidates focus their attention on people who donate $5, $10, $50, up to $150. We'll restore power to that senior who makes a $25 donation. I've co-sponsored the Fair Elections Now Act in the past, and I'm proud to co-sponsor it again in this Congress. This isn't going to solve all of the problems created by Citizens United and McCutcheon, but it's a step in the right direction. Finally, there's something else we can do, and honestly, it's the one thing that we most need to do if we're going to repair all of the damage the Supreme Court has done, and that is amend the Constitution to reverse the Citizens United and McCutcheon decisions. Now, let me be clear. Amending the Constitution is not something I take lightly. I think that it should be done only in extraordinary circumstances. But the Supreme Court's decisions present us as one of those situations because they erode the very foundation of our democracy. Now, I know what you're thinking. Constitutional amendments are really hard to come by. They require agreement by 2/3 of both chambers of Congress, and they have to be ratified by at least 3/4 of the states. It's no wonder that constitutional amendments have been so rare in our history. Well, look, just because a constitutional amendment takes a long time and is difficult to accomplish doesn't mean that it's not worth trying. It took a long time, much longer than it should have, to enshrine women's suffrage into the Constitution, but it got done because it would have been an affront to our democracy had it been otherwise. These things take time and patience and persistence and perseverance, but they happen. In fact, there's already momentum building. I'm proud to co-sponsor a constitutional amendment that has been proposed here in the Senate and would restore legal authority to the people to regulate campaign finance. The states are moving in the right direction, too. According to Public Citizen, 16 states have already called for a constitutional amendment. I believe that it's time for us to answer the call.